The storm didn't just bring snow, it brought judgment. It swept through Lone Hollow like a phantom, turning the main street into a river of white. Lamps sputtered, their weak light swallowed by the blizzard. Every door was locked tight. Every window was a frosted eye staring out into the gale. And behind those windows, people were watching. They were all watching the girl. Her name was Chenoa, and she was staggering through the heart of the storm, alone. Her shawl, once the color of a white bird, was now a sheet of ice. Her hair, a thick braid, had come loose, whipping against her face like a frozen rope. She gasped for every breath, and it felt like she was breathing in the town's hate. Each step was a punch through the snow, a loud crunch that echoed in the unnatural quiet. It was the sound of guilt. That's what they wanted to hear. They'd already decided she was guilty, even though she'd done nothing wrong. Her name was a curse on their lips. It started with a rancher's son, Silas Ward, his tongue loosened by whiskey. He'd boasted. He'd lied. And his lies caught fire, spreading faster than flames on a dry prairie, leaving her name scorched, branded with a shame she never earned. The women clucked their tongues. "Ruined," they whispered. The men just smirked. "Easy," they muttered. When she tried to speak the truth, no one listened. Ruthie May, the tavern owner with a heart as cold as her beer, had shoved her out the door. "Keep your head down," she'd hissed, "and pray." But prayer offered no warmth, and the night was getting colder. Her legs finally gave out at the edge of town. She stumbled, her dress dragging her down, and pitched forward into a deep drift. The sky was a merciless gray ceiling pressing down on her. Snowflakes felt like tiny needles against her skin. She tried to push herself up, her hands trembling, but she just sank deeper. A hollow thought bloomed in her mind. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was how it ended. The snow would just swallow her whole, and the silence would finally wash away the shame. The wind would carry her story away, and no one would ever sneer at her name again. But the wind carried something else. It wasn't a whisper. It was a sound. The creak of leather, the solid crunch of footsteps that didn't falter, and the sound of a man breathing, slow and steady, as if the storm was nothing more than a mild breeze. She lifted her head, her vision blurred by the swirling snow. And then she saw him. He was standing there, shirtless in the middle of a blizzard. It was impossible. He looked like he was carved from the storm itself, some dark, angry piece of the mountain. His skin was the color of bronze, glistening with a thin layer of frost that clung to his broad shoulders. His hair was long and black, a wild mane whipping around his face, and his eyes were as dark and hard as river stones, and they were locked on her. He moved with a terrifying grace, each step silent and deliberate, like the frozen ground was yielding to him. Chenoa's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard the stories, the whispers in the saloon about Apache scouts on the ridges, raiders who moved like ghosts, and now one was here, standing over her. It was a cruel joke. The town casts her out, and the wilderness sends its most feared hunter to finish the job. She tried to scramble away, to run, but her legs were numb, useless. The wind tore her icy shawl from her shoulders, leaving her exposed and small. He knelt in the snow. His shadow fell over her, huge and absolute. She flinched, bracing for a rough hand, for pain, but his touch was gentle. His wide, calloused palm brushed the snow from her cheek. His breath was a warm cloud in the frozen air. He leaned in, his voice so low it was almost part of the wind. "I'm going to be your slave," he whispered. His English was accented, each word heavy and deliberate, as if pulled from the deep earth. "You just don't know it yet." Her mind reeled. The words made no sense. Slave? It had to be a threat, a mockery. But his tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't lustful. It was certain, like a vow. She tried to speak, to scream, but her body was spent. He scooped her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. His chest was a furnace against her frozen skin, an impossible warmth in the heart of the blizzard. She buried her face against him, her breath catching in her throat, caught somewhere between raw terror and a strange, bewildering surrender. From the frosted window of the tavern, Ruthie May watched it all. Her eyes narrowed into slits of contempt. She saw the giant Apache, bare-chested and fearless, stride back into the storm with the girl in his arms. A cruel smile twisted her lips. "Well, there she goes," she announced to the room. "Shame finds shame. Let the snow have them both." Nods of agreement rippled through the tavern. They had their story now. Chenoa, the ruined girl, stolen by a savage. Twice ruined. The tale was already setting like ice, hard and sharp and perfect. The storm swallowed them whole. He walked for what felt like hours, his steps never faltering. Chenoa was cradled against his chest, the steady beat of his heart a drum against her ear. In the swirling gray light, she studied his profile. A strong jaw, a nose that had been broken long ago, and those dark eyes, fixed on something far ahead that she couldn't see. The snow hammered against his bare skin, but he didn't seem to notice. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Why? Why save her? Why speak those impossible words? It felt like he was telling her she still had worth, even after her own people had thrown her away like trash. She wanted to fight, to demand he put her down, but every shiver racking her body was a betrayal, a confession of how weak she was. Discarded, left to die, and now carried off by a man her people called an enemy. The shame of it was a bitter pill, but underneath the bitterness, there was something else, something she was afraid to name. It felt like relief. As they reached a dark line of trees, the wind began to die down. The world became muffled, wrapped in a thick blanket of white silence. He finally stopped before a small, rough-hewn cabin, almost invisible against the snow. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, and a wave of warmth washed over her. A fire was crackling in a stone hearth. He gently lowered her onto a bed of soft furs near the flames. Her breath fogged in the sudden heat. For a long moment, he just stood there, looking down at her with that same intense, unreadable gaze. Then he turned to the fire, poking the logs until a shower of golden sparks danced up the chimney. His silence was a heavy thing, but it wasn't empty. It was watchful. It was waiting. Chenoa lay there trembling, caught in a dizzying limbo. Was she a prisoner, or had she been rescued? Was this a new danger, or some strange twist of fate she couldn't comprehend? His whispered words echoed in her ears. "I'm going to be your slave." A promise? A curse? She couldn't shake them. Outside, the snow began to fall even harder, sealing them in, as if the storm had decided their fates were now tangled together, whether they wanted them to be or not. She closed her eyes, feeling the fire's warmth on her face, watching his large shadow move across the wall. For the first time all day, she didn't feel completely alone, but a sharp spike of dread kept her from relaxing. She opened her eyes again. He was kneeling by the fire. He had a long knife in his hand, and he was sharpening the blade with slow, methodical strokes. The steel glittered in the firelight, catching flashes of orange and red. His face was a mask, impossible to read in the flickering glow. He hadn't spoken another word. He didn't have to. Those first words were still hanging in the air, louder and more terrifying than the howling wind outside. The fire hummed, a low, steady crackle in the dead quiet of the cabin. Chenoa sat wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, the shivering finally starting to subside. Sleep hadn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces, the smug smirks in the tavern. Ruthie May's venomous glare, Silas Ward's mocking laugh as he told her she wasn't welcome. The memories were colder than the frost that had clung to her eyelashes. She looked at her own hands, half expecting them to be different, as if the town's gossip had physically stolen a part of her. The man whose name she still didn't know moved like a shadow. He poured water from a bucket into a clay cup and set it beside her without a word. Then he went back to the fire. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't asked why a girl was dying in the snow. His silence was unnerving, but it was a different kind of silence than the one back in town. Their silence was a weapon, filled with scorn. His was observant, as if he was waiting for her to put the broken pieces of herself back together. She had to say something. Her voice was thin, fragile. "They think I'm ruined." The words hung in the warm air, brittle as glass. He didn't turn, didn't react at all, just kept his eyes on the flames. But she felt his gaze on her, and she hated how quickly she looked away, down at the floorboards. "Even if I went back," she whispered, There's nothing for me there. She wasn't sure he even understood, but a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening in his shoulders, told her he did. He broke off a piece of dark bread and held it out to her. The gesture was so simple, yet it stopped her cold. In town, when a man offered a woman something, there was always a price, a debt to be paid. But this bread was just bread. It lay in his open palm, an offering with no strings attached. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, crisscrossed with old scars that told stories of battles she couldn't imagine. She ate slowly. The bread was dense and smoky, and it tasted like a strange, unexpected kindness. The firelight threw his face into sharp relief. The hard line of his jaw, the straight bridge of his nose, the white line of a scar that cut across his cheekbone. She realized his silence wasn't emptiness. It was a choice. He was choosing to give her space, to not trap her with questions or demands. But even here, miles away, the weight of Lone Hollow pressed down on her. Back in the tavern, Ruthie Mae was holding court. She stood by the pot-bellied stove, her voice sharp and loud, making sure everyone heard her version of the truth. "Carried her off, he did," she declared, her eyes gleaming. "One of them, Apache devils. Big as a barn, half naked in the storm like it was nothing. And she went with him. Oh, she didn't fight. Not like a decent girl would." The women around her nodded, their faces a mixture of pity and smug relief. "Better her than one of us," their expressions said. The men grunted their agreement. Sheriff Malden Crow stood in the doorway, his hat pulled low, casting a shadow over his face. He listened, his eyes narrowing. He'd known Chenoa since she was a child. He'd stood by her father's grave. He knew Ruthie Mae's tongue was sharper and more dangerous than any knife. But he stayed silent. In a town like Lone Hollow, the law was no match for a good story. Silas Ward slammed his empty glass on the bar. "I'll get her back," he snarled. His pride was still stinging from her refusal the day before. He'd offered her a job, a place to stay, but his eyes had promised something else entirely, something dark and possessive. She don't belong out there with some savage. She belongs here, where she can be looked after. A few men laughed, a ugly, knowing sound. The sheriff's frown deepened, but he still didn't move. In the cabin, Chenoa clutched the blanket tighter. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. Even with no one here to judge her, she felt the need to confess. "They'll say I chose this," she whispered to the fire. Her eyes darted to the silent man, Tassa, half expecting to see disgust on his face. Instead, he was grinding herbs in a small stone bowl. His hands were large, but his movements were steady, precise. He added hot water, and a bitter, medicinal steam rose into the air. He handed the cup to her. She hesitated for a second, then drank it down. A gentle warmth spread through her, loosening the knot of fear in her chest. "You don't talk much," she said, watching him. "Do you think I'm a fool?" His gaze met hers. It was steady, deep, and gave nothing away. He seemed to consider her question for a long time. Then he spoke just 2 words. His voice was a low rumble. "Storm passes." The simplicity of it was like a slap. He wasn't dismissing her. He wasn't mocking her. He was just stating a fact. Storms pass. A strange burning started behind her eyes. It wasn't shame this time. It was something else. Something raw and fierce and new. By dusk, the fire had turned the cabin into a warm, amber cave. Taza returned from the woods, 3 snow-white rabbits slung over his shoulder, tiny drops of melted snow glistening on his skin. She felt a sudden urge to be useful, to not be a helpless burden. She busied herself with the fire, her movements awkward. He saw her struggling but didn't intervene. He just handed her the rabbits, a silent gesture of trust. She cooked the meat over the flames, her fingers trembling slightly, the rich scent filling the small space. It smelled like survival. Later, when she finally worked up the courage to look at him across the fire, really look at him, something inside her shifted. He wasn't a captor. He wasn't a savage. He was an exile just like her. He was carrying a loneliness as heavy as her own. And she finally understood. That bizarre vow he'd made in the snow, that he would be her slave. It wasn't about power or domination. It was about sacrifice. He was putting himself at her level. He was standing beside her in her shame, not looking down on her from above it. The thought was deeply unsettling, but in a secret, hidden corner of her heart, it felt like coming home. But outside the safety of these four walls, the storm of gossip was growing into a hurricane. Ruthie Mae's story spread from the church steps to the general store. By nightfall, Silas Ward had gathered a handful of men, his whispers of honor and revenge fueled by cheap whiskey. The town's scorn was hardening into a dangerous resolve. In his office, Sheriff Crow sat alone, the lamplight flickering across his desk. He polished his badge with his thumb, the metal cool against his skin. He remembered Chenoa's face in the snow. He hadn't seen fear in her eyes when she looked at the Apache. He'd seen something else, defiance. He began to wonder who the real savages were. Night fell again. In the cabin, Chenoa lay on the furs, unable to sleep. She dreamed of torches bobbing in the dark woods, of angry voices shouting her name. She woke with a gasp. The fire was just glowing embers, and Tassa was sitting by the door, perfectly still, a bough resting across his knees. His gaze was fixed on the forest outside. He was watching. He was waiting. The night felt heavy, pregnant with a silence that was about to break. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the storm wasn't over. It was just changing form. And when it hit them next, it wouldn't be a storm of snow. It would be a storm of men. The snow just kept falling, muffling the world in a deep white quiet. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching them. Days bled into one another, marked not by conversation, but by small, silent actions. A language of gestures began to form between them, stitching their two solitary lives together. Every morning, Chenoa woke to a fire already blazing. The scent of roasting meat or steeping herbs would already be filling the cabin. She'd turn her head and see Taza already at work, his bare back to the cold as he split firewood or checked his snares. She never once heard him get up in the night, yet his presence was a constant shield. The cabin felt safer, the timbers stronger, just because he was in it. She craved words, something to fill the vast silence between them, but none came. So she started listening in a different way. She listened to the steady rhythm of his knife as he scraped a hide. She listened to the evenness of his breath when the wind howled outside. She listened to the soft thud of his boots in the snow when he returned from a hunt. His language was one of action, of constancy, and slowly she was beginning to understand it. One evening she decided to try and give something back. Her hands felt clumsy, but she was determined. She found a sack of flour and a small tin of lard and began to knead dough on a flat stone near the hearth. The dough stuck to her palms, and she cursed under her breath, feeling foolish. Taza, who had been mending a snowshoe, paused his work. He watched her for a moment. She braced herself for him to take over, to do it himself. But he didn't. He simply placed a small bowl of warm water beside her and then stepped away, giving her space. His eyes said what his voice did not. "I trust you to do this." A sharp, sweet feeling pierced her chest. The bread she made was lumpy and uneven, but when she offered it to him, he took it and ate it with a quiet focus, as if it were the finest meal he'd ever had. For the first time since the town had turned its back on her, she felt useful. She felt like she could give, not just take. At dusk a few days later, as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, she found him mending the tear in her dress. She was mortified. "You don't have to do that," she protested, her voice small. That's not your work." He ignored her, threading a piece of sinew through a bone needle with surprising dexterity. His large, scarred fingers were incredibly precise. The firelight flickered across his hands, and she realized that every careful stitch was another silent offering. He wasn't just fixing the cloth. He was mending something inside of her that had been torn open. One night she found herself humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing. She stopped abruptly, embarrassed, but she noticed that Taza's hands, which had been sharpening an arrowhead, had stilled. He didn't look at her or say anything, but that small pause was enough. She knew the song had reached him, had touched some part of him he kept hidden from the world. It was in that moment that she truly started to believe his vow. "I will be your slave." He wasn't trying to chain her to him with desire. He was binding himself to her survival with his devotion. but the world outside their small bubble of silence was growing louder. On the third day, the crisp air was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. Chenoa's heart leaped into her throat. Sheriff Crow appeared at the edge of the trees, flanked by two deputies, their long coats dusted with fresh snow. Taza was on his feet in an instant, the bow in his hand, his body filling the doorway like a stone wall. The sheriff raised a hand. His voice was steady, but she could hear the strain in it. "Girl, the town says you're being held here against your will. I've come to take you back." His eyes met hers and they were searching, almost pleading with her to make this easy. Fear was a bitter taste in her mouth. Behind her was the warmth of the fire, the quiet strength of this strange man. In front of her was the cold judgment of the town she used to call home. She was trembling, but she took a step forward, then another, until she was standing so close to Tasa that her shoulder brushed his arm. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the snow with the weight of her decision. "I stay." The deputies shifted uneasily. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He looked from her to the imposing figure beside her, and back again. After a long, tense silence, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice heavy, "but this won't end here." He turned his horse and the three men rode away, the crunch of snow fading until the forest was silent once more. Chenoa felt her knees go weak, but Taza didn't move. He stood there for a long time, his bow still ready, his eyes scanning the trees. She leaned against him, just slightly, needing his strength to hold the weight of the choice she had just made. The moment was as fragile as a pane of ice, but it held. That night, sleep was impossible. The wind moaned around the corners of the cabin, and with every gust, she imagined the sound of angry footsteps. Taza sat by the dying fire, sharpening his long knife again, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the room. Finally, she couldn't stand the silence any longer. "They will come again," she whispered into the darkness. His eyes lifted from the blade, meeting hers across the glowing embers. He didn't speak. He just gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had always known. His certainty should have terrified her. But instead, it was like an anchor in the storm of her fear. The gossip in town could rage all it wanted. In here, the silence was stronger. In the days that followed, a new routine took shape. She started walking with him when he checked his snares. At first, she stumbled constantly in the deep snow, but he never showed any impatience. He just slowed his long strides to match hers. She learned his silent language. A slight tilt of his head meant rabbit tracks. A hand pressed flat against the bark of a pine meant they needed to be still, that something was watching them. He never corrected her when she made a mistake. He just showed her again, his patience, a quiet lesson. One afternoon, he came back with a huge armload of firewood. She reached out to help, and as she took a log from him, her fingers brushed against his. They both froze. For a single charged moment, they stood there, their breath mingling in the cold air. Something unspoken, something powerful passed between them. She turned away quickly, her cheeks burning, but the warmth of that brief touch stayed with her. Their bond was growing, layer by silent layer. It wasn't the loud, hungry things she'd seen in the eyes of men like Silas Ward. This was quieter, deeper. It was like the way roots grow under the snow, unseen but incredibly strong. She started catching herself looking at him, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Hope. But hope was a fragile thing. In Lone Hollow, Ruthie May was turning whispers into shouts. Silas Ward was fanning the flames, promising his friends that he would reclaim what was his. The town's anger was simmering, ready to boil over. On the fourth night, Chenoa was kneeling by the fire, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked over at Tasa, wanting to say something, anything, to thank him, to ask him what he was thinking, but the words died in her throat. He had moved without a sound and was now standing right behind her, his shadow blanketing her. For the very first time, she dared to meet his gaze and hold it. His eyes were dark and steady, and in their depths, she saw something she'd never seen before. Not pity, not judgment. It was recognition. It was as if he could see right through her shame, and what he saw there wasn't ruin. It was a strength she didn't even know she possessed. Her breath caught, and then a new sound split the night. It was distant at first, a low murmur on the wind. But it was growing. It was the sound of many voices, angry and determined, coming through the trees. She froze, her eyes wide with terror. Tasa didn't hesitate. He reached for his bow. The world they had built in silence was about to be tested by fire. The dawn was a faint, gray promise, painting the snow in shades of rose and ash. It wasn't the cold that woke Shanoa. It was a sound. A low hum of voices outside growing louder, heavier with every passing second. She shot up, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Taza was already at the door, bow in hand, his body coiled like a spring. He'd been waiting for them. Through a small clear patch on the frosted window, she saw them. Torches, a sea of wavering lights moving through the trees. The town had come for her. Figures emerged from the gloom, bundled in heavy coats, rifles held loosely in their hands. Their eyes glinted in the torchlight, filled with a righteous fever, the kind of fever that comes from gossip and hate. Ruthie Mae's voice cut through the morning air, sharp and brittle. "Come on out, girl. You don't belong with him. You belong with your own people." The irony was a bitter pill. The same people who had thrown her out into a blizzard now demanded her return, not to welcome her back, but to reclaim ownership of her shame. She looked at Taza. His face was a mask of stone, but she could see the tension in the muscles of his jaw, the storm gathering in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just a fight. This was a trial. Sheriff Crow stepped out from the crowd, his tin badge the only thing that caught the weak morning light. He held up a hand trying to quiet the mob. "Chenoa," he called out, his voice strained. "You've been accused of being held captive. You step out now, we'll take you home." Home. The word felt like a lie. What home? The tavern that had bolted its doors? The women who had spit on her name? The greasy smile of Silas Ward waiting around every corner? She looked at the warm fire, then at the cold crowd. She looked at Tassa's shadow, so steady and silent beside her. She rose, her legs shaking, and placed a hand on his arm. It was a signal. "I have to do this myself." The cabin door groaned open, and the bitter cold hit her like a physical blow. She stepped out, barefoot, her thin dress whipped around her legs. The crowd fell silent. They stared at the girl in the snow. Her hair was a wild tangle, her face pale, but her eyes were burning with a fire they had never seen before. "She's bewitched," Ruthie Mae hissed, clutching her shawl tighter, as if Chenoa's sudden strength was a contagious disease. Chenoa's voice trembled at first, but she forced the words out. "I am not his prisoner. I am here by choice." A harsh, ugly laugh erupted from Silas Ward. "Choice?" he sneered, pushing his way to the front. His rifle gleamed in the torchlight. "What choice does a ruined girl have, except to run to the first savage who'll have her? Don't you try to dress up your shame and call it dignity, Chenoa." His words were like stones, and the crowd roared in agreement. Her throat felt tight, but she lifted her chin higher. "If this is shame," she cried, her voice ringing out across the snow, "then I choose it. It was not you who gave me shelter. It was not you who lifted me from the snow when I was dying. It was not you who thought my life was worth saving." Her breath plumed in the cold air, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For a moment, the crowd was stunned into silence. But Ruthie Mae wasn't finished. "Don't listen to her," she shrieked. "He's poisoned her mind. She's just scared." Chenoa ignored her. She took another step forward, the burning cold of the snow seeping into her feet, until she was standing right in front of Silas. His eyes narrowed with fury. "I fear your pity," she whispered fiercely, "more than I could ever fear him." Silas's hand shot out, his fingers closing around her wrist like a vice. "See?" he shouted to the crowd, yanking her forward. "She's confused. She belongs with us." The world exploded into motion. Taza moved faster than she thought possible. One moment he was by the door, the next he was there, his bow drawn, the arrow aimed directly at Silas's heart. He was a terrifying sight against the gray dawn, his bare chest slick with melted snow, his hair a wild storm around his face. Every muscle in his body screamed a promise of lethal violence. The crowd gasped, stumbling back. Sheriff Crow drew his pistol. "Enough!" he yelled, his voice cracking like a whip. His eyes darted from Silas to Taza to Chenoa, and in that instant, something in his expression changed. The doubt was gone. He wasn't looking at a captive anymore. He was looking at a woman standing by her protector. The mob was losing its nerve. Some of the men lowered their rifles, but Silas was too far gone. His pride was a raging fire. With a roar, he shoved Chenoa to the ground and raised his own rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down. Chenoa hit the snow, a cloud of white powder rising around her. She heard the creak of Taza's bowstring as he pulled it tighter, his eyes narrowing to slits. The crowd held its breath. "Silas Ward!" the sheriff bellowed. "You put that gun down now, or this ends in blood." The authority in his voice was absolute. Even Ruthie May fell silent. Silas stood there, his face contorted with rage, his whole body trembling. But the sight of the sheriff's pistol and the unmoving arrow aimed at his chest was enough. With a curse that he spat into the snow, he slowly lowered his rifle. Chenoa scrambled to her feet, gasping for air. She looked at Taza. His bow was still drawn, his body a perfect statue of controlled fury. For a terrifying second, she thought he would shoot anyway. But then he let out a slow breath, and the tension flowed out of him. He lowered the bow. The restraint of that single action was more powerful than any act of violence. The sheriff turned to the crowd. "Go home," he commanded. "All of you. This is over." One by one, they turned and shuffled away, their torches extinguished in the snow, their angry shouts fading into whispers. Ruthie May gave Chenoa one last look of pure venom before disappearing into the trees. Silas spat on the ground, a silent promise that this wasn't finished. The dawn was quiet again. Chenoa stood there shaking, her bare feet numb and burning. She looked at Taza, who was still watching the trees where the last of the mob had vanished. She understood now. The fight with the town wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the bond they had forged in silence would now have to survive in the open, against an enemy that would never stop. She reached for his hand, needing to feel his solid strength. His fingers closed around hers, a silent promise of both a shared burden and a shared devotion. She shuddered, but not from the cold. It was the terrifying weight of knowing that she had just bound her fate to his, in front of all her enemies. And then, just as the sun finally broke over the ridge, a new sound echoed from deep within the forest. A single, low blast from a horn. It was a sound that didn't belong to Lone Hollow. Taza's head snapped up, his body instantly tense again, his eyes narrowing. The sound that called to them now wasn't the voice of the town. It was something older, something wilder, and it was much, much closer than she had ever imagined. The echo of the horn lingered in the frozen air, a sound that felt ancient and ominous. Chenoa's hand tightened on Taza's. The mob from Lone Hollow was gone, but this felt infinitely more dangerous. The horn sounded again, closer this time, a deep, resonant call that seemed to make the very trees vibrate. Taza's face was grim, a shadow falling over his features that she had never seen before. He took a step forward, away from the cabin, his bow held ready. "Who is it?" she whispered, the words barely audible. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The rigid set of his shoulders told her everything. Whoever was coming, Taza feared them. And Taza, she was beginning to realize, feared very little. Suddenly, a figure crashed through the undergrowth, but it wasn't the owner of the horn. It was Silas Ward. His face was blotchy with rage, his eyes wild. He hadn't gone back to town. Pride and humiliation were a toxic brew, and he was drunk on it. "You think you can make a fool of me in front of my own town?" He spat, his voice shaking with fury. "I'm not leaving here with nothing." He raised his rifle, but he didn't aim it at Taza. He aimed it at her. The world shrank to the dark, round hole of the rifle's barrel. In that split second, every cruel whisper, every slammed door, every ounce of shame the town had heaped upon her came rushing back. She was frozen, but Taza was not. He moved like a blur of motion, a force of nature unleashed. The bow was up, the arrow loosed in a single fluid movement. There was a sharp crack as the arrow struck the rifle's stock, sending it spinning out of Silas's hands and into a snowdrift. Silas stumbled backward, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The forest was utterly silent again. He stood there, disarmed and powerless, his eyes darting between the grim-faced Apache and the girl he had tried to break. The rage in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by something else. Fear. Raw, primal fear. He turned and scrambled back into the trees, his frantic retreat a pathetic end to his blustering pride. Chenoa let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her knees threatening to buckle. She looked at Taza. His chest rose and fell with a single deep breath, and then he was still again. He could have killed Silas, easily, but he hadn't. He had chosen restraint. He had chosen to protect without destroying, and she finally truly understood the meaning of his vow. It wasn't about ownership. It was about shouldering her burdens as if they were his own. The sheriff had told the town this wasn't their trial to hold, but Taza was holding it with her. He was standing with her against every storm, from every direction. She stepped toward him, her body still trembling, and reached out, laying her hand on his arm. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold. His strength was a solid, reassuring presence under her fingertips. He turned his head and looked down at her, and for the first time, the guard in his eyes was gone. She saw not a warrior, but a man, and in his gaze there was a startling vulnerability. "I have nothing," she whispered, the truth spilling out of her raw and painful. "No home, no family, a name that's been dragged through the mud. They'll never leave me be." He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he spoke, his voice that low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Then I am nothing too," he said. "We are the same." The words broke something open inside her. The tears that had been burning behind her eyes finally fell. But they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of release. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, closing her eyes, letting the solid feel of him block out the rest of the world. His arms came around her, not in a gesture of possession, but of pure shelter. When they finally walked back to the cabin, the sun was fully risen, turning the snowfields into a glittering expanse of gold. She sank onto the furs by the fire, utterly exhausted, every muscle aching. Taza knelt in front of her. He gently took her bare feet in his hands and began tending to the raw, red skin, his touch so careful it was almost reverent. She watched him, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality of it. This fierce, silent warrior, kneeling before her, treating her wounds as if they were sacred. Her lips parted, the question she'd been holding back for days finally escaping. "Why?" He looked up from her feet, his dark eyes meeting hers. He spoke the vow again, but this time the words were not a mystery. They were a key. "Because I am your slave." He lifted one of his large hands and placed it flat over his heart, a gesture of profound solemnity. "Not to chains," he said softly, "to love." Her breath hitched in her throat. The words landed with more force than any shout, any threat, any declaration she had ever heard. In town, love was about what you could take. Here, in the quiet of this cabin, she was learning that love could be about what you were willing to give. It was about offering your strength not to control, but to lift someone else up from the snow. The firelight danced on his face, a mixture of shadow and gold. She reached out a trembling hand and brushed her fingers against the scar on his cheek. "Then I am yours too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not because they cast me out, but because you were the only one who saw me." For the very first time, the corner of his mouth tilted upwards in a faint smile. It was like watching the sun break through a week of storm clouds. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the warm glow of the fire. The moment wasn't a whirlwind of passion. It was slow. It was fragile. It was earned. She closed her eyes, feeling the sheer weight of his presence, the steady strength of him, settling into her bones. It felt like coming home. Outside, the forest was quiet. The mob was gone. The horn was silent. But they both knew it wasn't over. Ruthie Mae's venom would find a new outlet. Silas's pride would fester and seek revenge. And the horn was a promise of a different kind of trouble. But none of it seemed to matter right now. In this small cabin, surrounded by silence and snow, they had found a truth that was stronger than gossip, stronger than hate. When the fire burned down to glowing coals, they were still there, her hand held in his gaze on her, unbroken. Let the world outside call them ruined. Let them scream and judge and plot. Within these four walls they had made their own law, their own tribe of two. The girl who had been cast out and the warrior who had been feared had bound themselves together. Not with words shouted for a crowd, but with quiet gestures and the shared will to survive. Their love was their rebellion. In the years that followed, the story would twist and turn in the telling. They would talk of the wild girl who ran off with an Apache, a story of savagery and shame. But the truth was simpler and far more profound. She wasn't stolen. She was seen. And he, the silent shadow from the ridges, had given himself not as a master, but as a servant to her heart. The last embers of the fire hissed, sending a final shower of sparks up into the darkness. Chenoa laid her head on Tassa's chest, listening to the steady, reassuring drum of his heartbeat. For the first time she could remember, she felt no shame. Only the rhythm of his heart, a rhythm she knew she could follow into any storm that was yet to come. They had found something the world outside could never understand, something forged in silence and tempered by snow. If you enjoyed this story of two outcasts finding justice on their own terms, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next one.